This nature of mind that we were discussing yesterday, this empty, clear, and unimpeded state of awareness, is not something which is subject to birth or death. It has always been the case that there has been this nature of mind. Up until this point, the mind has been experiencing the cycle or process we know as samsara, the cycle of conditioned rebirth, due to the karmic tendencies which have developed in the mind, positive or negative. Now, many people feel that there's no continuity between one state of existence and another, that mind does not pass from one to the other, and so that one cannot speak about things like previous existences or future existences. And the reason they usually give is that there's no direct evidence. We can't see this taking place. We have no empirical evidence that there is this connection. But that really shouldn't surprise us, because what is experiencing that whole process, what is experiencing the pleasure and pain of rebirth after rebirth, is the mind itself, which is intangible. If one cannot see or perceive the mind directly, mind itself, then it should not be a surprise that one cannot perceive the karmic process or the continuity from one state of rebirth to another. That doesn't mean it doesn't exist, it just means we cannot perceive it in that way. The Buddha said at one point, if you wish to see, or if you wish to understand what actions were committed previously, look at your physical body in this life. Because the connections that are established in a previous lifetime through positive or negative actions create tendencies that mature or ripen in this lifetime and determine the way in which we experience this life. So that while on a general level the human state of existence is a relatively superior one, indicating a relatively predominant element of positive karma in our makeup, there are many various experiences. There is a whole spectrum of experience that we as human beings can undergo. It may be that due to positive actions such as generosity and protecting life and so forth in previous lifetimes, we enjoy long life and health and happiness in this life. It may be that due to negative actions such as the taking of life and stealing and so forth in previous lifetimes, that we experience a short lifespan in this life as human beings, that we experience much sickness, much suffering, poverty. It is to these previous actions that we need to look to understand why what we now experience is taking place. The Buddha also said, if you wish to see where the mind is going, what the mind will experience, look at your actions now. To understand what actions already took place, look at your body. To understand what will take place, look at your actions now. Because there again is a connection between the karmic patterns that we establish and reinforce now and what the mind will experience in future states of rebirth. This pure nature of mind, this empty, clear, and unimpeded state of awareness, is what is technically termed the alaya in Sanskrit, or kunji in Tibetan, which means the basis or source of everything. In this case, it is an aspect of transcending awareness, the pure alaya, which is the origin or source of all enlightened experience. What we now experience is also the levels of confusion and ignorance and emotional conflict that we were speaking of yesterday. These taken together constitute an aspect called the impure alaya, or the fundamental confused awareness or discursive consciousness. If on the one hand, the pure alaya is like crystal clear water, transparent water, then this other side of things, the impure alaya, is like mud, which has been thrown into the water and is polluting or obscuring that transparency. And what we experience then is a mixture of the two states of being, this impure alaya, the levels of confusion and ignorance, obscuring the pure alaya, the fundamental nature of mind itself. Now, given that this is the case, that there is this obscuring factor of the mud in the water, one of the functions of this impure alaya is to store, as it were, impressions, which are karmic tendencies, latent karmic tendencies, so that when actions are committed, physically, verbally, or mentally, these create impressions or tendencies which are, as it were, stored or remain latent in this fundamental level of discursive consciousness, of confused awareness, until such time as conditions are appropriate for that tendency to arise as conscious experience. So that once an activity has been committed, once an act has been committed, that tendency remains latent on an unconscious level until the proper circumstances for it to emerge again as a conscious experience, the act leading to an experience. This is the karmic process. What this means is that karma has a certain infallibility to it. One can never expect a tendency that has been created by a certain action to somehow get lost somewhere, or to be forgotten about, and hope that somehow one can avoid the consequences of it, that it just isn't going to happen. Because it is an infallible process. At sooner or later, at some point or another, that tendency is going to come into contact with the correct conditions to emerge as a conscious experience. The Buddha said at one point, once a karmic tendency has been established through an action, it doesn't matter if 1,000 kalpas, 1,000 eons pass. That latent tendency remains effective until the time that circumstances cause it to emerge as a conscious experience, and then it is exhausted. But until it has emerged as conscious experience, one can never expect it to be lost or forgotten or somehow just to fade away. It simply will not. Because there is this infallibility to the karmic process, this infallible connection between what we do and what we experience, this makes the whole question of positive and negative action a very important one, understanding what kinds of tendencies are positive ones that lead to happiness and fulfillment, and what are negative ones that lead to suffering and confusion. In speaking about this fact that all beings have this Buddha nature, but that these levels of confusion and ignorance cloud or obscure the issue, the Buddha said in one tantra, all sentient beings are Buddha, are enlightened, but incidental stains or obscurations obscure that fact. Once those incidental stains have been removed, what is now a potential becomes actualized as the experience of enlightenment. What this implies is that one's level of attainment or realization is directly proportionate to the removal or elimination of these levels of ignorance and confusion and emotional conflict and so forth in the mind. For example, one way to define or to look at the various levels of bodhisattva realization is with regard to these four main levels of obscuration in the mind, beginning with fundamental ignorance, with dualistic clinging, with emotional confusion, and with karma. The attainment of the first level of bodhisattva realization, first bhumi, is more or less synonymous with the removal of that first veil of karma, the grossest or the most outer level of confusion. A being who experiences that first level of bodhisattva realization has transcended that level of karmic obscuration. Or to say it another way, a being that has transcended the level of karmic obscuration attains to the first level of bodhisattva realization. The two define each other. On the seventh level of bodhisattva realization, the second kind of confusion, the second layer of confusion, on the seventh level, this layer of emotional confusion, which has been gradually refined or diminished, is finally eliminated. It is no longer an obstacle to that being, that seventh level bodhisattva, attaining enlightenment. On the final three levels of bodhisattva realization, the 8th, 9th, and 10th levels, which are termed the three pure levels, the level of dualistic clinging, the habitual tendency of mind to conceive of self and other as entirely separate, this is gradually refined and eliminated to the point where it becomes non-existent. It is no longer an obstacle. But it is only with the attainment of complete enlightenment, the passing beyond the 10th level of bodhisattva realization to complete Buddhahood, which is sometimes termed the 11th level, simply because it is all that is beyond the 10th level, and which is sometimes termed in Tibetan kundu, which means light everywhere, or total illumination. It is only with that attainment that the most subtle levels of the most subtle confusion, the fundamental ignorance of mind, are finally eliminated, finally wiped away. And the most subtle veils of ignorance in the mind are finally eliminated, so that the nature of mind itself is free to simply manifest or express itself without hindrance. So the process of spiritual development can be seen in terms of removing or diminishing the obscuring influence of these four levels of confusion: fundamental ignorance, dualistic clinging, emotional confusion, and karma. The physical body that we now experience during our waking state is the result of certain karmic tendencies which have come to full maturity. Certain karmic tendencies which have ripened or come to full maturity in this life. In the case of ourselves as human beings with this particular precious state of human existence, the karmic tendencies have been largely of a positive nature. This has been largely virtuous activity leading to positive karma, And it would seem that there has been some element of connection, karmic connection, with the three jewels, the Buddha Dharma, through some kind of means, through seeing something or hearing something or coming into contact with something in some way. And all of this has contributed to the particular physical embodiment that we now experience. There is this physical basis for the consciousness which distinguishes this state of experience. But the mind experiences other states than the physical waking state. The most significant of these during our lifetime is sleep and dream. Because when we do go to sleep at night and dream, the mind experiences another kind of body, as it were, which is not quite the physical body, because the physical body at that point is asleep. But the mind is experiencing a whole realm of experience, a whole phenomenal world, which does not have that physical basis. But nevertheless, the mind conceives of a kind of body or embodiment through which it experiences that dream world. This state of experience is conditioned by two factors. The first of these is a very subtle, habitual tendency of the mind to conceive of things in dualistic terms, self and other, subject and object. The other element which conditions the dream state is the more obvious level of habitual tendencies and experiences during this life, certain patterns that we develop in this life that show up in our dreams. The technical term for this particular state is the embodiment based on habitual tendencies, because there are these two factors, the subtle habitual tendency of dualistic fixation and the grosser tendencies of experiences in this life, establishing certain patterns. There's no physical basis for that state of existence, but the mind relates to it as though it were very real. Now, when we die in the future, and the physical body and the mind separate, and the physical body is no longer a factor in the mind's experience, there is what we term the bardo state, the after-death state, between death and physical rebirth. Now, this bardo state is peculiar in that there is no physical basis for the consciousness here either. There is no physical body, but the mind continues to behave as though there were, continues to experience things as though there were a body there, when in fact there is not. This tendency of the mind to experience a body where there is none is a phenomenon known in Tibetan, or in the terminology, as the mental body, or the mental embodiment of the bardo state. These are the three major phases of our experience that we can see if we are looking at this cycle of samsara. The mind is continually passing from one of these states to another, from the physical waking state to the dream state to the disembodied state, to the mental body of the bardo, back to physical waking existence. And these three phases of our experience constitute the cycle of samsara. And as samsarans, as beings in samsara, we experience those three phases, one after the other. The point is, in each of these three states of experience, the mind takes what is going on to be absolutely real. What is in fact happening is a process where the projections of mind are experienced by the mind as though they were something other than the mind itself. But the mind is absolutely convinced in each case that this is actually happening, that these things really are taking place. Whether we're talking about the physical embodiment, whether we're talking about the dream state, whether we're talking about the bardo state, the mental body, the mind is absolutely convinced that what is taking place is true and real on an ultimate level, rather than understanding that what is taking place is a process of projection and experience of the projection. So, on an ultimate level, of course, we can only ascribe relative or conventional reality to any state of experience, including this one in the waking state. Take the example of a being in hell. The mind of that being is absolutely convinced that what is taking place is actually happening, is the ultimate reality, some kind of objective reality. Now, in any state of experience, the projection of mind is as empty, essentially, as the mind itself. This essentially intangible, empty mind cannot give rise to something solid or independently real. It partakes of that intangibility of mind. But this is not something that the mind understands at this point. So for the mind of a hell being, all of this is really taking place, and all of this suffering is being inflicted by something out there which is ultimately real, rather than the process being understood as impressions from that mind arising as this experience of suffering. In one particular text, Shantideva, an Indian Buddhist master, says, in a verse of poetry, he said, "Who creates this, the burning iron which burns one in hell? Who creates all of these flames which scorch the being in hell?" The Buddha said that all of these are the projections of an evil mind, or a negative mind state. Which is to say that no one makes this hell and then puts beings in there. The beings make their own hell. The negative karmic patterns in the minds of hell beings create the impression of a state of hell as though it were actually true, as though there actually were something we could call hell, where beings were sent or where beings went. What in fact is happening is that the impressions in the mind of that being are creating the illusion of this realm of hell, as though it were something ultimately real. But it is no more real than any other state of experience. It has only a conventional reality for the being in that particular situation at that particular time. How are we to understand this statement that mind is empty? What indication do we have that this is the case? To begin with, when a child is conceived in the womb of the mother, when we came into this world, this was not something our parents were immediately aware of. The moment the conception occurred and that consciousness was united with the physical basis in the womb of the mother didn't immediately think, I'm pregnant, I have a child. She didn't watch the consciousness come in and take that physical form. It's not something that becomes obvious until later, when the physical signs of pregnancy show. That's a sign that the mind is intangible, it's essentially empty. It's not something that one can watch taking conception in the womb. One simply is not aware of it happening. Every one of us at some point will come to die. And when the consciousness leaves the body, no matter how many people sit around watching, nobody's going to say, oh, there it goes, when the mind leaves the body. Nobody can see that happening. Just one moment there is a living being, and the next minute there is a corpse. And where is the mind? Nobody saw where the mind went. That again is an indication that that mind is intangible, it's essentially empty. We have several hundred people in the room here. Each one of us has a mind, each one of us is experiencing that mind, but none of us are experiencing anybody else's. We have no way of telling what the other person's mind is like. And actually, when we come right down to it, we have no idea what our own mind is like. We can't even see anything that we can pin down and say, oh, it looks like that, it's shaped like that, it's that color, it's there, it's that size. We can't do that kind of thing with the mind. You simply cannot pin it down in that way. It is essentially empty. It is intangible. It does not behave according to those kinds of characteristics. However, to take the opinion, as people sometimes do, that, well, right, the mind is absolutely empty. That's absolutely true. Therefore, nothing matters. Nothing has any reality at all. Karma is completely meaningless. There's no such thing as causality. Well, that's really a misinterpretation. That's making a big mistake. To assume that simply because something is essentially empty that it has no validity. The Buddha said at one point, those who believe in the ultimate reality of things are as stupid as cows. Those who believe in the ultimate non-reality of things are even more stupid. And this is something which is dealt with quite extensively in the Prajnaparamita literature, the perfection of wisdom literature, where it is said that if one makes a mistake in one's view of emptiness, if one has too simplistic a view of emptiness, one is really cutting off one's own wisdom. One is really limiting one's own wisdom and destroying possibilities of future understanding growing. So it is something that's important to note, that the interpretation of what is meant or what is implied by the mind is empty should not be a really simplistic one, but all the implications should be understood. Until such time as one has thoroughly realized the emptiness of mind and the emptiness of all experience, this causality that exists between actions and experience and the interdependent nature of all aspects of experience continues to remain absolutely true and valid, completely infallible. And to take an example, we can consider that each and every one of us has spent a fair part of our lives going to school or to college, university, learning things, developing skills, developing trades, amassing information. But all of that, the result of all of that learning process is not something that we can see tangibly. It isn't stored somewhere in Germany. They don't have a place where they store everybody's information or everybody's knowledge. You don't keep it at home somewhere in the closet. It's not stored anywhere in your body that anybody could see. But the tendencies have been established in your mind in this fundamental level of discursive awareness, the alaya, the kunji, the source or fundamental consciousness. And whenever you need that knowledge, it's there. You can call it to conscious memory and make use of it. So it is perfectly valid. The fact that it is essentially empty and intangible doesn't mean that it isn't valid. If a person learns how to be an auto mechanic, they learn that skill very completely. They can go anywhere they want. And wherever they go, wherever they encounter a problem with a car, they can fix it. Now, until such time as they need that knowledge, they don't walk around continually reminding themselves of how to fix a car. They don't need to, because as soon as they get into a situation where there's something that needs repairing, they know immediately what needs to be done and they can do it. There's that kind of effective causality, that kind of effective connection between learning the skill and making use of it. But none of it is anything that you can see or that you can pin down tangibly. But it certainly is very effective and very valid. And so is any aspect of causality, any aspect of karma. Once one has realized the meaning of emptiness, once one has this direct experience, then one is like Milarepa. Milarepa said of himself, "It was fear of dying or fear of death that drove me into retreat, and I meditated constantly on impermanence and death. But now I have realized the deathless nature of mind, and death holds no fears for me." The point is that Milarepa was at first motivated by a very healthy awareness that his negative karma was going to drag his mind down to some lower state of rebirth. That was perfectly valid in the situation. He was perfectly right to assume that. And it was the fear of death and the fear of those consequences that caused him to start meditating. But as he meditated, he attained finally to the level where he realized the deathless nature of mind, the nature of mind itself, and the illusory nature of all experience that the mind projects and experiences. At that point, he was freed from the normal limitations of what we think of as physical reality. He could manifest one form or many as he chose. He could fly in the air, he could pass through solid objects. Because his mind had attained to the state of awareness where he was simply no longer subject to those normal limitations of what we take to be physical reality. He had seen that all of these projections of mind were essentially speaking, ultimately speaking, illusory, like a rainbow, like a reflection, like a mirage or a magical appearance, like the surface of the water reflecting the image of the moon. Something that is perfectly valid and apparent, but has no ultimate self-existence. And that was the state of realization that allowed Milarepa to demonstrate what to us are miracles. Something that totally breaks all the rules of physical reality. But it was simply because his state of realization was greater than ours. And he did not ascribe to these things the reality that we do.
Matapala tapanze, Domala Devanzen, Kosapa Champion. That won't, down at the Toman, and the Tona, Sarakatan was, Sajatan was, and Sanchan the Nichan was, that Toman, that is, Shan Tombe, the Jan Mandala, suppose. The Charles get the Toman, Condit to Chilton. More original about Toman, that's what it is. Just quando ci fanno domani, domani per la mandiata, that's what it is. That's how it's happening. Ci can't c'è
The process of samsara, of us experiencing this cycle of rebirth, is due to or defined by three basic misconceptions that we make continually. The first is that we are continually looking for something ultimately real where there is not any ultimate reality. We're continually investing things with a reality they don't have. That's one problem. We don't understand the phenomenon in question, or the phenomena that we experience, to be the projections of mind, but treat them as something totally real other than the mind itself, completely independent of the mind. And because we ascribe that reality to something which does not have reality, that perpetuates the whole process. The other mistake we make, or another mistake we make, is a failing to see the suffering that is inherent in the way we now experience things, from very gross to very subtle levels of suffering and frustration. Continually looking for some kind of ultimate happiness in all of that, and continually ascribing happiness where there in fact is none. Certainly not happiness in any ultimate sense of the word. But because we continually look for it where it doesn't exist, we make a second mistake. And the third mistake we make is of ascribing some kind of permanence or stability or reliability to something which is totally impermanent. We're continually looking for something permanent where there is nothing permanent. Continually looking for something reliable where there is nothing reliable. So we make these three fundamental errors. We take something which is ultimately unreal to be ultimately real. We take something which is frustrating and painful to be something happy, conducive to happiness. And we take something which is impermanent to be permanent. It's based upon those three kinds of misconceptions that we, samsarans, continually experience this cycle of rebirth. We continually move from one state of experience to another, treating everything as though it were very real, very permanent, and very conducive to happiness. And that is the cycle of rebirth, chasing after those misconceptions. Now, understanding one's experience and understanding the phenomena of the world around one to be based upon the projections of mind is extremely important. We hear a lot of talk about Mahamudra, this big fancy word for what is in fact the realization of emptiness. Milarepa described or defined Mahamudra in the following way. Mudra in Tibetan, mudra is Sanskrit. The Tibetan word is shakja. 2 syllables, the first of which, shak, Milarepa says, is a code word for emptiness. The second word, ja, which means in Tibetan extensive or vast, is the syllable which means that there is no aspect of experience that passes beyond that awareness of emptiness. When one has had that experience, it embraces everything. It's an all-embracing experience of emptiness, and there's no aspect of one's experience that is beyond that basic awareness. And this is the definition of the term mudra then. The term maha, which is chempo in Tibetan, which means great or vast or supreme, simply means, in this case, that there is no experience greater than that awareness. It is the supreme or the ultimate experience. So we have the term Mahamudra, this big fancy word for what is in fact the realization of emptiness, that embraces every aspect of one's experience.
Tata Naro Santo Mani, the Machine, Naro, on the Dallas of the Mature Goddess. There then to have touching the goddess. Takarisana, Naro Dallas of the custom calling Jones, do not touch a Satan. That shut in the Tatona, or so the other Dallas of the Tay 먼저 또 치지 않는 탐지 대도 때 로를 옆에 많이 대도 말이지 대다부터 맞잖아요 로이 몰라 다 산데 또 말은 좀 맞으면 다 전부가 실수나 저런 한번 챙겨주는 거지.
In failing to perceive the true nature of mind as essentially empty, we instead experience this self, this I, this solid thing in the place of this emptiness of mind. That is our fundamental mistake. That is the fundamental problem. That is where all of the suffering and frustration and pain arises. It's quite true, as the teachings tell us, that I and the clinging to self are the biggest demon in the universe. The greatest demonic force in this universe is this sense of self, or I, because it is that which causes the trouble, which causes the problems in the first place. The realization of Mahamudra is the realization of the essential emptiness of mind. And once this realization takes place, once this I, this self, is no longer perceived as something ultimately real, once the projections of the mind are not experienced as something ultimately real, then one has attained this realization that is termed Mahamudra, which is sometimes referred to as the experience of egolessness. The egolessness or non-self of an individual, and the egolessness of phenomena, all the different aspects of experience. It is at that point that the mind is freed from all of that suffering and all of that malevolent influence of egocentricity, of ego clinging. There's no longer any basis upon which suffering can develop. Even though this might not be part of one's direct experience at this point, one might not have realized emptiness. Even the intellectual conviction on a conceptual level that it is the case is extremely beneficial. Simply to have the idea, the mind or the I is not something ultimately real. It has no color, it has no form, it has no shape, and so forth. None of this is ultimately real. Even to have that kind of conception is very helpful, even though it might not be part of one's direct experience yet. It's simply an idea still. But the idea in itself is very valuable.
다 가렸어요. 그러나 또 많이 그런데 아주 실수나 그러면 내셔도 여러 작가들 내가 어쩔 때 다시 내가 하고 있는 거라고 얘는 산들 내가 뭐 내가 가네셔 때나 저도 좀 말을 영화 가고 때 내가 뭐 말을 영화를 내가 산들 내가 뭐 내가 뭐 다 또 많이 해주셔서나 아무튼 내가 뭐또 참 좋아요. 내가 가는 좋아요. 차가로 또 맞도서나 내가 또 많이 되는데 맛이 타나고 싫어. 대체해서나 내가 빼는 다서 싶은 저 맛을 판다고 좋아요. 여러분은 또 많이 되는데 해서나 체크만 체크 뭐 이거 나한테 못 받아. Just how this realization of emptiness is beneficial in this particular situation in the West, in Europe and North America, is best understood by taking into account that the physical comfort, the material prosperity of these countries is such that people, human beings in these particular realms of Europe and North America,
are experiencing what looks to like other people like the realm of the desire realm gods. Certainly we can't look on a physical level for a great deal of our suffering. Things like hunger, starvation, things like this, they simply are not as common in the West as they are in other parts of the world. On the other hand, there is incredible suffering on a mental level. This is primarily where we as people in the West experience our suffering, is on a mental level. And the principal reason is because, first and foremost, of this misunderstanding of the emptiness of mind, and instead the conception of this self or I. But the principal contributing cause is the emotional confusion that we experience. Because we invest all of these emotions with such reality, we treat them as things in and of themselves, and surrender to them continually. And this is where a great deal of our confusion and a great deal of our suffering lies, is in that emotional confusion. Through understanding the emptiness of mind, one understands the emptiness of what arises in the mind. Once one has understood the mind to be intangible or essentially empty, then automatically one understands that the thoughts and emotions that arise in the mind do not have any more tangibility than the mind itself. They don't have any more ultimate reality than the mind itself. They are no more solid than the mind itself, which is to say they're not solid in the least. So instead of having to treat an emotion of passion or anger or whatever as incontrovertible, absolutely solid and real, and one simply has to follow after it, instead of that, one has a situation where it's as though one took cold water and threw it into boiling water, and all that agitation was suddenly just calmed. Because one's understood that the emotion is no thing in and of itself. And one simply doesn't have to treat it as real, as one normally thought one had to. It simply is not necessary. It doesn't have that kind of reality. With that kind of understanding, even on an intellectual level, of the emptiness of mind, and this empty, clear, and unimpeded mind nature, whatever particular technique of meditation one uses is far more effective. When one is using a shamatha technique, something to calm and stabilize the mind, whether it's breath meditation, or meditating on a sphere of light, or meditating on any other form, physical object, whatever technique one is using is going to be far more effective for allowing the mind to become calm and free from distracting influences of thoughts and emotions, more able to rest, to simply focus itself and rest in any given state of awareness. Ideally, this can be extended to the point where whatever technique one is using, one can simply place the mind in that state for as long as one wishes, and it'll just stay there. The mind does not have to be distracted. There is a conscious ability of the mind to simply rest in any given state without distraction. That is the ultimate from the point of view of shine, or shamatha, of this first stage of meditation. Now with it, this brings about a feeling of quite incredible mental and physical well-being. Something far more than we could really conceive of at this point. Even this first stage of shamatha, before the insight of vipassana sets in, even this brings with it a real sense of physical and mental well-being. And it is also this state of shamatha, of tranquility and stability of mind, that gives rise to certain, perhaps unstable, but certain kinds of psychic powers, clairvoyance and so forth. They arise from this kind of shamatha experience, from this tranquility and stability of mind.
Then I come back to Kayana, and I sang a melody, or some of the Colas of the Shabbat of Manipa, no more Shabbat, Record sang a melody, Kadi Marshasona, part of Popa, and Sagana. Then one thing that come up, the subject of that then I was subject to that Topala, then Jenny Joe Carlos, Takakosona, then I hit to the also about the larger bone. Oh, the love is not one other, Target, and more Subasas, but also
Beyond this experience of shamatha, of the tranquility and stability of mind that first comes about through effective meditation, it is possible for the person to develop insight, deeper insight into the nature of mind. The direct experience of this empty, clear, and unimpeded dynamic awareness, which is the nature of mind, which is beyond an intellectual understanding. It's not something that one merely understands to be the case or has some conceptual idea about, but it becomes an actual direct experience. This is what is termed vipassana or hlaton, deeper insight. Now, if this insight continues to deepen and the person continues to develop their meditation, this can culminate in the Mahamudra experience. Direct, total absorption in the nature of mind and the nature of all phenomena. But in order for that to come about, two things are necessary. In one of the commentaries on Mahamudra, it says, in order to develop this state of co-emergent awareness, of transcending awareness, one should understand that other than one's own efforts to purify oneself, to accumulate merit and deepen and develop one's wisdom, other than one's own personal efforts and the blessing of a qualified guru, any other means are stupid, is what the text says. One's really wasting one's time, unless one is going about it in those two ways. To really realize Mahamudra in the ultimate sense of the word, one needs to make efforts oneself to purify oneself of negativity and obscurations and ignorance, and to develop one's merit, deepen one's awareness. So on the one hand, one needs those personal efforts. On the other hand, one needs faith and devotion in an authentic guru to receive that guru's blessing. Once those two things have come about, then the ultimate attainment can take place. But any other means are really wasting one's time. At a certain point, when one is developing along this path to Mahamudra, or of Mahamudra, there is a certain stage at which the authentic experience of the empty, clear, and unimpeded nature of mind becomes completely stable. Now, this is a bit complicated because the technical terminology of the Mahamudra path speaks of 4 levels. One-pointedness, simplicity, one flavor or one taste literally, and beyond meditation. Each one of these has 3 degrees, an inferior degree, an intermediate degree, and an intense degree. Now, with this experience of the nature of mind, the Mahamudra experience first becoming completely stable, this is the experience of simplicity, the second of the 4 stages. And all 3 degrees of simplicity, inferior, intermediate, and intense, taken together constitute this experience. It culminates or peaks in this experience of the nature of mind, which is still not the ultimate attainment, but is the first really significant level of insight. This is what is termed as well first bhumi, first level bodhisattva realization. This level is termed rabduga in Tibetan, which means total joy or complete joy. Because with that discovery of the nature of mind, there is the experience of a joy and a delight and a well-being which is simply not anything we can conceive of at this point. There is no physical or mental state of bliss or ecstasy or joy that we can experience now that can hold a candle to that kind of joy. It simply cannot compare to that kind of joy. That is the joy which is completely spontaneous. It does not depend upon any given situation at all. It simply is inherent in the nature of mind. And as the mind discovers its own nature, there is that joy, that incredible joy. So that is the reason for the name Rabduga, for the name total joy or complete joy. This state of realization is marked by certain qualities that indicate that the mind is becoming freed of its limitations and is more free to express itself in different ways. So that for someone experiencing this first level of bodhisattva realization, it is possible for the mind to experience not one state of meditation, but 100 states of meditation at a single instant without any contradiction. Right now, when we're using a technique in meditation, for example, we may be using breath meditation or meditation on a physical object or a point of light or the form of a divinity or a certain sensation. We might be meditating on emptiness, a formless state of meditation. But we do things one at a time because the mind is limited at this point. The mind of a first level bodhisattva can handle 100 of those at a single instant, and there's no contradiction. Nothing's left out, nothing is conflicting with anything else. The mind is free to experience 100 states of samadhi at one instant. It is free to express itself in 100 emanations in a single instant, rather than being limited to one physical form. It is free to experience 100 different pure realms of experience, to meet with 100 Buddhas, to receive teaching in 100 different ways at a single instant, to recall 100 previous existences, to foresee what states of existence the karmic tendencies will lead in 100 states of future existence, and so forth. These different qualities are traditionally listed as 12 in number, and each one of them involves 100 previous existences or 100 states of samadhi or whatever. So they are often called the 1200s, which are simply indications that this first level of bodhisattva awareness has taken place, and the mind is that much freer to express itself. As the mind continues to develop in this way then, and as the insight continues to deepen and the freedom of mind continues to express itself more completely, we can distinguish different stages or different levels of realization. And these are what are known as the 10 bodhisattva levels, the 10 bhumis. From first bhumi then, the mind attains to this second level of bodhisattva realization, where all of these qualities that were described, the 1200s as they are called, increase tenfold, increase by a power of 10, so that we are speaking of 1,000 instead of 100. 1,000 states of meditation at a single instant, and so forth. This increases from one level to the next by powers of 10. So by the time we are speaking of 10th bhumi, 10th level bodhisattva realization, we're no longer speaking of 100 or 1,000, we're speaking of tens of millions of states of meditation at a single instant, or emanations at a single instant, or whatever. Beyond that, the only statement that can be made about Buddhahood beyond the 10th level of complete enlightenment is that one can no longer speak in limited numerical frameworks. One can no longer speak of how many or how much. It simply makes no point at that stage. We're speaking of an infinite level of awareness, an infinite level of possibility, an infinite level of compassion, and so forth. There simply is no limit to the ability of the mind to express itself on the level of Buddhahood, because Buddhahood is, by definition, the absence of all limitation. The mind is simply free to express itself. The point is that the mind that is experiencing that state of Buddhahood is the mind that we experience now. Buddhahood is not something outside of the mind itself. It's not something you have to go looking for other than in the nature of mind itself. The only difference is whether or not there are limitations and obscurations in the way or not. In a text known as the Uttara Tantra, which was given to a Sangha by the Bodhisattva Maitreya, it is said that the only distinction to be made on the basis of sentient beings, bodhisattvas and Buddhas, is whether there is impurity present, whether there is purity, or whether there is complete purity. Whether there remains confusion and ignorance, or whether there is not. As unenlightened beings, we experience a great deal of impurity in the sense that there is this confusion, this ignorance, negativity, and so forth. On the bodhisattva levels, this has been more or less removed, but not completely so. On the level of complete enlightenment, it has been completely removed. But that's the only basis for making a distinction between an unenlightened being, a bodhisattva, and a Buddha.
Shenayaris, that then I was in a militant and then I was landing with others.
If this is the goal towards which one is working in the practice of Dharma, this attainment of complete enlightenment, of Buddhahood, some appreciation of our present situation is necessary to understand where we're working from, which implies an understanding of the cycle of rebirth, of samsara, and our particular situation in it as human beings. The mind that we now experience in this human state of rebirth has been undergoing states of existence on an infinite scale, one state after another after another. At a certain point directly previous to this lifetime, quite obviously there was a karmic situation that would result in a precious human rebirth, which we now are experiencing. But at that point, there was simply the mind in the bardo state, in the after-death state, following whatever our previous existence was, as whatever kind of being. And the mind in this state was directed towards this human state of rebirth by those karmic tendencies. Now, one of the peculiar circumstances of the bardo state is a certain kind of limited clairvoyance or prescience that the mind has. It's not a particularly controlled quality. It is simply something that is part of that state of experience that arises unbidden. And in the particular case of a human being taking, or a mind taking rebirth as a human being, there is a kind of vision or a kind of awareness of the mother and father in sexual union at the moment of, or before the moment of physical conception. And the mind is drawn towards that act of the father and the mother in union by these karmic tendencies which are drawing the mind towards that physical state of human rebirth. There is an emotional response of the mind to the parents, which is an unconscious one, an impulse, as it were, based upon whether that child will be male or female, whether the karmic tendencies are dictating female or male body. If the mind will take rebirth in a female body as a girl child, there will be attachment towards the father, attraction towards the male parent, and aversion to the female parent. If, on the other hand, the mind will take rebirth as a male child, there will be attraction for the female parent and aversion to the male parent. But regardless of which circumstance takes place, there is this emotional reaction which is part of the conception process. Conception which actually occurs when the sperm from the father and the egg cell from the mother unite with the consciousness of the being in the bardo. So there are two physical elements and one mental element. And with that conception, with that fertilized cell imbued with that consciousness, one has a human being, potentially. Of course, the form is just this fertilized cell at that point. But the consciousness with all the potential for human existence, human experience, is there, as is the physical structure, the potential for that physical structure. At this point, there is simply a central channel of energy, which is the first stage of the mind's physical expression. When it begins to express itself on a physical level, it begins with just this central channel of energy, which exists even on this very embryonic level. There is the consciousness and there is the life force of the being. And then gradually, both the mental and the physical consciousness. Slowly, during the 9 months or so, 9.5 months, which is the rule of thumb, the term of pregnancy, during this time, the mental and physical aspects of the child begin to develop. This is most obvious on a physical level because the cell begins to divide and there's this mass of cell tissue that becomes elongated and extended and passes through these various stages of fetal development as the limbs begin to extend themselves and the senses begin to develop and the organ systems begin to differentiate and so forth. And also there is a gradual development of consciousness and awareness a gradual stirring and developing of more complex states of awareness, until such time as the child is fully developed and the karmic tendencies which have brought about the conception and growth of the fetus come to an end, and the process of birth occurs. Up to that point, of course, the child has been receiving nourishment from the umbilicus, from the mother's body. The food and drink that the mother takes in is nourishing the child on a physical level. But it is the karmic tendencies which are in the makeup of the child that are propelling that process of fetal development to the point where the child is actually expelled from the mother's body in the process of physical birth, and the child actually comes into the human realm as a fully formed human individual, still just a baby, but still with all of the organs and faculties of a human being to experience that particular realm. That is the process that all of us went through to arrive where we are now. We could spend a great deal of time examining how this physical structure of the body is put together, how it comes together, and how it falls apart, of course, inevitably, with death. How the various elemental qualities constitute the physical body, how the various sense fields develop, and so forth. This could be gone into in far greater length, but suffice it to say that at this point we have this physical body. It has come together in a particular way. We were born, we went through this conception process, the fetal development, the birth process, through infancy, through youth, and all of us have arrived either at young adulthood or middle age or even old age. And this process is a relentless one. From the moment of conception to the moment of death, there is this continual growth and change of the organism. The aging process involving with it as well disease and sickness, imbalance, suffering on that level, and the process simply of growing older, of the body starting to fall apart, simply because the karma maintaining that existence is starting to break down. Eventually this will bring all of us at one point or another to death, where these various elemental qualities that make up the body dissolve and are absorbed one into the other in a process of dissolution, and the mind and physical body finally separate at the moment of physical death. At that point the mind goes into a state of unconsciousness. The dying process as one state leads to another state, which is one of primordial unconsciousness, the first phase of the so-called Bardo experience, the after-death state. Following that, there is a process of conscious experience, still with no physical basis for the consciousness, where the mind experiences all kinds of experiences, pleasure and pain. And finally, this is brought to an end too, by the karmic forces dictating the next conception or the next physical rebirth in whatever state, human or otherwise. But that is the future that the mind faces. That's infinite process of samsara, from one state of experience to another, with no end in sight. The significant point about the human state of rebirth is that it provides us with the opportunity to transcend all of that, to attain enlightenment which is beyond all of that suffering and frustration and limitation of the cycle of rebirth, which is a state of true happiness, a real freedom of mind. So that is the important thing, to remember that in the context of the human birth, we have the freedom and the opportunity to attain to that state of enlightenment. That kind of opportunity does not really exist in any other state of existence than the human one. The human body that we have right now, this physical existence, provides a lot of potential, one way or the other. In the traditional text, it is said that the physical body could be the boat that ferries one across the ocean of suffering to the far shore, to enlightenment. Or it could be the stone around your neck that drags you down to the bottom of that ocean. Because the physical body is like a servant to the mind. If the mind directs the body in positive ways, the body will behave in positive ways. If the mind directs the body in negative ways, the body will react accordingly. And it is through the karma that we accumulate with our physical actions as well as our mental actions and verbal actions. It is that karma that determines whether the mind attains to higher states of rebirth, or ideally to liberation, or whether the mind falls into some lower state of rebirth with further confusion and further suffering. It is all up to the choice we make. We have that choice in the palm of our hands now, and we can choose to go one way or the other. We really are on a kind of pivotal point, or kind of frontier, boundary between up and down. With that, perhaps we could close the morning session with prayers to dedicate the merit of the teaching for the benefit of all beings.